So the title that I chose for this talk today is Regenerating Cities, the Indirect Role of Culture. And I chose this particular title because there are different elements I strongly believe in. And in particular, the role of culture in local economic development and in this respect, in the regeneration of cities. And again, specifically the indirect role of culture. And I'll be trying to tell you how and why in the next minutes. So, first of all, I would like to start this talk providing you with some perspectives on the relationship between culture and local development. So I'm a regional economist, and I tend to speak about local development, but I think the concepts I'll be sharing with you today are very well applicable to urban regeneration. And again, I'll try to be more specific in a few minutes. But first of all, I would like to highlight that the importance of culture, history, religion, and identity in determining the potential of any territory to develop has been by now quite widely recognized, both at the academic and at the institutional level. And as a regional economist, I really think that this is the case because, in fact, place and culture are persistently intertwined. And this is the reason why, as regional economists, we really care about this topic. But I said that I wanted to provide you with some perspectives on the relationship between culture and local development. And the first one is perhaps the first one that comes to everyone's mind when we think about the relationship between culture and local development, and it is tourism. I know that this is not very much the perspective that is taken here in Łódź within the program of regeneration, but I think it is still an important perspective we hear a lot about. But here I would like to highlight, okay, the mechanism I think is quite clear. So culture attracts tourists, they come, they spend money, and this favors local economic development. Fair enough. However, these are benefits for sure, but there are also costs in terms of congestion, in terms of increased pollution, in terms of increased petty crime, in terms of social conflict and conflict with the local residents. So what does prevail in the end? We have cost and we have benefits. What does prevail in the end? The truth is that we don't know. Or it depends on every single specific place we do look at. So I'm not saying that tourism is not important, I'm just saying that we should be very careful about tourism. But there's a second perspective I would like to highlight, and in this case the relationship between culture and local development is through entrepreneurship. In this respect, there's the idea that some specific types of culture in more anthropological terms, like mindset, traditions, history, folklore, way of thinking, can favor local entrepreneurship, and through this mechanism, local economic development. That's for sure, quite well proved in economics. But the perspective I would really like to drive your attention to today in this talk is on the relationship between culture and local development through favorable context or territorial conditions. And in particular, I'll be focusing on multidimensional creativity and territorial identity. And this is because creativity and identity are characteristics that are deeply rooted in a given place. And so they're specifically interesting in this respect, I think. Oh, I'm sorry. But before going on with this talk, I would like to make a distinction between tangible and intangible cultural heritage. So, what is tangible or material cultural heritage? well, here I stick to the UNESCO definition, and, well, tangible cultural heritage includes buildings, structures, monuments, landscapes, and historic centers of cities and towns. Fair enough. I think we can agree on this. And intangible or non-material cultural heritage, again, I do stick to the UNESCO definition, includes the practices, representations, expressions, memories, knowledge, and skills that communities, groups, and individuals construct, use, and transmit from generation to generation. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, in fact, both. And not only because we are going to talk about both tangible and intangible cultural heritage as two distinct elements, but because another aspect I strongly believe in is that material, tangible cultural heritage is nothing else but the expression, the physical expression of intangible meanings, meaning that it is the result of a place's history and tradition and sense of belonging. So what you do see materially as tangible cultural heritage is in fact also strongly representative of intangible meanings. So we're going to talk about both tangible and intangible cultural heritage, not only because we're interested in both aspects, but because they are really strictly related. So having said this, I'll try and get to my main point today. So some indirect mechanisms that relate culture and local development, and specifically in the case of urban regeneration. So, as I've already kind of anticipated, I think that we need to overcome the belief that culture counts just in terms of its impact on tourism economy. And in fact, my impression and my strong belief is that cultural heritage and culture more generally, if you wish, is a determinant of curiosity, capacity to doubt, to learn, and to innovate. And in this respect, it is a trigger of critical thinking. And if this is the case, then the importance of culture, although indirectly, is even more than what we are used to think. So I would like to highlight some more complex and sophisticated mechanisms, indirect indeed, through which culture can lead to local economic development and urban regeneration. And these are mechanisms that have been studied at Politecnico di Milano within the research group I belong to. So the very first is related to intangible context conditions. What do we mean by intangible context conditions? Well, we do refer to what we call intangible cultural capital, and that is associated with social, ethical, and behavioral values. So what my colleagues found out is that in places that are better endowed with intangible cultural capital, the effects of culture on local economic development are quicker. So in this respect, intangible cultural heritage favors, mediates, or even better, catalyzes the impact of culture on local development. And then I would also like to tell you something about the role of local creativity in this mechanism. And I really care about that because I've been working on that for a few years now, so that's my favorite, of course. And, well, how does it work? The idea here is that, well, first of all, again, creativity is a deeply territorial characteristic. It comes out from the features that you have in a place, its history, its people, so it's really locally rooted. And the idea is that it's not only locally rooted, but it is multidimensional, meaning that you may identify different types of creative talents. Personally, I identified empirically 3 types of creative talents: artistic creativity, scientific creativity, and economic creativity. And the idea here is that culture inspires local creativity, and through these mechanisms favors the generation of new and original ideas, and therefore triggers local economic development. And I found out that this is even more true when culture inspires a multidimensional idea of creativity, where you have the so-called cross-fertilization of different creative talents. So again, culture inspires multidimensional creativity, which in turn pushes local economic development. So again, an indirect role of culture that, mediated by creativity, leads to local economic development and urban regeneration, if you wish, in this respect. Finally, there's another aspect that has been studied within my research group in Milan, and this has to do with different types of territorial identity. Even territorial identity, of course, is deeply rooted into a place. So what my colleague found out is that places that are characterized by a more open-minded environment and higher levels of solidarity are better conducive in the relationship between culture and local economic development. So even in this case, you do see an indirect role of culture mediated by territorial characteristics in the relationship between culture and local development. So these are the aspects I wanted to focus on in terms of some indirect, again, more sophisticated and complex transmission channels that, that determine the relationship between culture and local economic development. But how do we, in a sense, apply this idea to the urban regeneration, which is the topic of this interesting conference? Well, through the activation of culture, in a sense. And this because I think that urban regeneration processes may use culture as a leverage for favoring the growth of critical thinking, but also sense of belonging, quality of life, and social cohesion. And how do you do that practically? And I'm very happy because this has already been mentioned quite some times within this conference, because practically you do that through the involvement of the local community in terms of cultural participation. And this is not only in terms of participation to the ideation and definition of the cultural activities, which is extremely important, but it's also a matter of cultural consumption, because cultural consumption itself favors, again, the triggering of critical thinking, sense of belonging, well-being, and social cohesion, if you wish. So cultural participation is extremely important, and again, this has already been reminded several times today. So I'm particularly happy about this because I'm in the right place, apparently. There's something I would like to highlight in this respect. My impression is that we need to be careful about physical, economic, and cognitive accessibility. Well, what is physical accessibility? Well, everyone in any condition should be in a position to access cultural activities in order to make them as inclusive as possible. But there's also economic accessibility, and this has already been mentioned today, talking about libraries. It was said that you can go to the library without spending any money, and that was perfectly fitting my talk here, because yes, there's economic accessibility, and now today we don't have time to go in greater depth into this particular topic, but of course there's a whole discussion about, for instance, entrance fees and all the related policies. If you want to favor, for instance, residents with respect to tourists or young students, sorry, or seniors, for instance. So that's a topic, of course. And finally, and I care about this, it's cognitive accessibility. What does it mean? It means that if we want to activate culture and cultural heritage in order to make it useful and effective within a urban regeneration process, the cultural content needs to be cognitively accessible for the local community. So the local community should be in a position to understand what is proposed, because otherwise we risk to propose cultural activities that are not very much related with the local community, and when this happens, I think you lose the final target. So cognitive accessibility in terms of the understanding by the local community of the cultural activity which is proposed. And, well, a way to practically activate culture that I would like to highlight is also taking advantage of digital technologies. How do you relate, this is a huge topic, of course, and I'm left with 2 minutes, but how do you relate digital technologies and taking advantage of culture and activating culture? Well, usually in 2 main ways. First of all, if you have material cultural heritage in mind, you can use digital technologies to rebuild digitally, not physically, some material cultural heritage that was lost, so that you convey the impression to the audience of what used to be, although it is not there anymore. But what I would like to drive your attention to today is another use of digital technologies, which implies the accessibility to the cultural content remotely. In this way, you widen the audience and potentially you broaden the positive effect of culture on urban regeneration. So even taking advantage of the newly available digital technologies could definitely be a strategy in this respect. And in my last minute, I would like to point out that if we believe, as I do, in the indirect role of culture within these processes, we need to be patient. Because, of course, if you have tourism in mind, the tourist comes, buys the entrance ticket for the museum, and that's money. And that's it. Very mechanic, but works somehow. So if you have a more indirect, sophisticated, complex perspective in mind, if you have an indirect role of culture in urban regeneration and local economic development in mind, you need to be patient, because these are long-term processes and we need to be aware of this. So with this, I'll shut up. I'm left with few seconds. And I'll just thank you for your attention. And that was it, because it disappeared. I wanted to try to read it in Polish, but since it is not there anymore, I don't think I can try, I'm sorry. So thank you.